Not clever, but you know, it's good to try things, try it out. If it doesn't work, that's all right. I was just listening there. That, do you know, that this just witnessing people singing along to stuff. My husband there clearly knows everything James Taylor has ever written because he was belting that out. I can hear the slightly discordant tone right. But you know, watching people here beginning to sing something they perhaps have never really heard before is part of the fabulous barking vibe there is around this entire independence campaign. I was just up at Shawlands shopping centre, and I remember I came across the water from Belfast when I was 13, and I can remember when I was at school here, somebody had a birthday party when they were 15 at some restaurant in there, and it was beyond cool. You know, it was so unspeakably cool and posh. I haven't actually been back for a very long time, but the place was stowed out. There are hundreds of people in there at the moment, so it's a heady time indeed. And it did strike me just listening there, you know, to the James Taylor song. I don't know if any of you are more familiar with that song, a fantastic song he wrote, Line Them Up, which was about Richard Nixon leaving the White House. And he asked them to line up the staff so that he could kind of say goodbye to them. But it's just that phrase that James Taylor caught, the sense of just the kind of sheer arrogance of the man. That, you know, the people who had served him for all those years were just numbers to be lined up, ticked off, you know, job done. And there's a wee bit of that in some of what's going on at the moment from some points of view. But let me just start off really, because I know it's a weird day today, because this event was booked some time ago when actually I was mostly talking about a book, and I was never sure who was in the audience. It could well be a lot of undecided people, it could have no people in it, it could have some yes people. And also, I wrote the book before the referendum was actually called. Any of you who've written a book in here might understand that you're actually writing it from just after you crawl out of the womb, actually. It takes a while for it all to kind of tick over. So, I mean, some of this now, I don't know if it's, well, I'm just going to tell you it like I see it. Because a lot of the reason for writing the book, for me, has been trying to kind of reconcile a puzzle about Scotland, which is the place is undeniably a beautiful, physically beautiful country. And I kind of got that very early on, because we came across the water from Belfast for our holidays every year across, you know, Larne to Stranraer, up to Glasgow, where we got lost every single year, spat out at random on different roads. We even ended up on the Loch Lomond Road trying to go to Banffshire once. And then up the A9 before it was dualled. I don't know if any of you are of a vintage that remember that. Behind the caravan all the way. You'd get up to Inverness, first stop Inverness after Belfast, after we came off the ferry. And you know, we get a wee 5 minutes there to go into the market, get some strawberries, back in the car, up, winding up and down in between the firths, because this is before there was a single broad bridge over any of those firths as well. And then we'd take a shortcut that some of you may know over the Struie, which would be our second stop. Dad would stop the car, we'd get out, and he'd say, "This is the finest view in Scotland." So we'd look there for 5 seconds, back in the car, all the way up to Wick. And that was our average trip in Scotland. You've got a kind of bit of communication coming in through your phone here. I tell you what, why don't we do a little bit of crowd participation here? So that was my kind of experience of Scotland. If we kind of moved 1 mile, we moved 400. And it always baffled me that, you know, Scots didn't seem to do that themselves. You know, there was an awful lot less travel in the country. But the virtue of it was that, you know, I could see the kind of incredible beauty there was and diversity even at that early age. And the number of roads that we go past that seemed to me to be full of mystery and gales, you know, over the west coast, because we were always thumping up the east coast. And, you know, so that was hugely impressive. When we went to our Banffshire grandparents, they were generally connected to oil and fishing, so we knew about the huge resources there was in the North Sea. Then we went up to Wick. Even then, in the 70s, people could point in the direction of the Pentland Firth and say, "Do you know the top 6 tidal stream sites in Europe are in that water?" People knew what the kind of renewable resource was way, way back then. And so here we are in this country that has got fabulous renewable resources, tremendous scenery, and you'd think that the people who inhabited a country like that would be healthy, wealthy, and wise. Now, we're just not doing that well on the healthy front at all. And, you know, we're living in a city here, in parts of which the average female life expectancy is under 50. Now, that's sub-East European. It's appalling. Generally speaking, and this is one of the cheeriest bits, the Scottish effect, if any of you have heard of that, it's often called the Glasgow effect, but it applies to everyone in Scotland. We're all tending to die 2 years earlier than our counterparts in the rest of the UK. That's whether you're male, female, rich, poor, your counterparts are just living a bit longer than us. Why? Nobody seems sure. If you look at fitness, we scored F for fitness a month ago in a European league table. And I know these days F can be quite good in schools. This is the old F, this is crap. So, you know, it's a puzzle because we are sitting in an environment that should be producing tremendously healthy people. Wealthy? Well, you know, in Aberdeenshire, there are more multi-millionaires per head of the population than there are in London. So we've got folk with money, but we know fine well we've got the other extreme as well. And that is what we've got. We've got extremes. And wise? We have a lot of self-harming behaviours. It seems, I mean, if you look at it, if you look at the tendency towards drinking too much, eating too much, you know, drug abuse and so on, these are kind of fight and flight mechanisms. And these mechanisms kick in when people are responding to acute, sustained stress. So there's something going on here that's not tickety-boo. And that's what made me start thinking about all of this, because how do you put that all together? Why is this all happening? And I suppose I was asking the question to myself then, what would it constitute for Scotland to be a successful country? And I think a lot of the time people kind of think that if we're just doing a couple of percentage points than England, to be blunt, at things, that we're doing quite well. So for example, at the last local government elections in Scotland, we had a 38% turnout, which is rubbish. But in England, it was 30%. Resulta mundo. Now, if we think like that, we're lost. Because actually, the European average turnout for local elections is 70%. I was in Sweden 2 weeks ago. Their last local government elections, 84%, without compulsion. So again, something's far wrong. And if all we're doing all the time is comparing ourselves and feeling a wee bit smug, because on issues of health, well-being, particularly child well-being, and democratic turnout, we are actually bumping along together. And it's not good enough to just keep looking across the border and think we're doing 1% better than them, that's a result. It's not a result. Not in terms of the resources that this country is blessed with. So I think we need to kind of think about a different way of measuring success. And I'd like to toss another wee one in here. We've been voting in a very characteristic way, the Scots, for the last 80 years or more. Since 1921, with the birth of the Labour Party, the Scots have been voting Labour at 40% or more for all that long time, with the exception of one national government and 3 Tory governments in the 50s. Don't know what they put in the water then. But that's a long, long time to have had that kind of voting record, and it is not replicated in any other part of the UK. It's incredibly different. If you know, of course, that we famously voted out every Conservative MP in 1997, for which we should have had some kind of prize, I feel. Not just being nasty to Conservatives, because actually there are far more Conservative people in this country that vote Conservative. And actually that's one of the great demonstrations of how our political system currently doesn't work. Because nobody wants to be allied with the greedy top-down elitism that conservatism has come to mean in Britain. But nonetheless, if we look at the last Westminster elections, for example, the percentage of MPs elected in Scotland who are Tory was just over 1%. The percentage of MPs elected in Wales who were Tory was 20%. The percentage of MPs elected in England who were Tory was 56%. Now that's not small differences. That's 1%, 20%, 56%. There's something very different going on there. And you could say, well, what is that all about? You know, are we having a laugh? Nobody's laughing, so I think that's not it. You know, are we trying to impress the neighbours? That hasn't worked either. Are we impressing ourselves? Clearly not. Maybe, just maybe, we're actually voting for a social democracy. Maybe over this long time, we've had a conception of a kind of way of running a state which is not a market-driven, top-down kind of society. Maybe we've always had a kind of idea of something else. But here's the other thing. You can't easily move to an alternative if you don't focus on it 100%. Just knowing that you don't want something is never enough in life to give you a sense of direction. You'll all know that from your own lives. So here's just a wee thought on that. Anybody in the company here able to ski? I'm not going to ask you to ski on the stage. Okay, nobody in this room can ski. I find, right, okay, there's half of you. Okay, well, I basically can't really, for like many Scots probably, didn't learn. But my stepdaughters wanted to learn to ski, so we went to France, started to go down the hill, and I realised that I didn't know how to stop. So we were tanking down the hill, and there at the bottom, there was a wee lassie sitting playing. And I thought, oh no, and I was heading straight towards her. So I tried to give her a few moves, but I had no moves, couldn't ski. So I'm still going straight towards her. And just before I hit her, I kind of keel over to one side, dump my heat, no sympathy. And afterwards, Rosie comes up and says to me, well, you're not listening to the instructor. And I said, well, evidently not. Irresponsible adult shock. And she said, well, what he said was, you just need to turn your head to look the way you want to go, and your skis will follow. Where were you looking? And this was like a big life moment for me, you know, where I thought there's a big truth in this. If you are fixated by the thing you want to avoid, you will head straight towards it. Because you're pouring your attention, your energy, your everything into that thing. And you can probably see where I'm going with this parallel. I think that's what we've been doing with Westminster. We are obsessed with it. Whether it's obsessed with it to avoid it, criticise it, whatever else it, what we need to do, turn the skis. We need to look in a different direction, otherwise we will keep producing mediocre results that are just a tartan shade better than one of the worst performing democracies in Europe. So where might we be trying to look? Aha. Now, I know everybody thinks that, that's in the least interested, that I once, feel that Scotland should just become a clone of Norway. I don't. I think, however, that in the kind of mongrel nation that the Scots are, we certainly have overtones that are a lot closer to the sort of social democracy that the Nordics have become. And some of us in this room, including the one that's standing speaking at the moment, have got DNA that is shared with those nations. And in any case, we're now at a stage where we're free to choose a direction to go in. So here's the thing. We might need to know a little bit more about other places other than America at election time, England the whole of the time, Ireland when it's doing well, and I don't know, what else do we hear about? We don't know enough about what a normal social democracy is like for us to kind of figure out how to get there, or to borrow ideas. Because this is the main point really of today's talk, which is a kind of difficult one depending on your outlook. Scotland is weird. Now, you may have got that already in life, but I mean, it's a difficult one for people to get their heads round, because naturally wherever you've grown up, you think is normal. I grew up in Belfast, and it was perfectly normal for bombs to go off all night. It was very normal to sit in a classroom with glass beside me in the window that was crisscrossed with sellotape to minimise any injury if there was a bomb. It would all come in one injury-minimising chunk. When I crossed the water to Scotland, I used to sit beside windows with no sellotape on them and feel scared. It was me that was weird. Now, wherever you grow up, you'll think is normal. Scotland is weird. It's weird, for example, because, you know the figures on land reform. 16 people own 10% of Scotland. That's the first weird. The second weird is that no one in the audience has reacted. Now, I quite get that you could be sitting there thinking, tell me something I don't know. But on the other hand, the lack of response to utter inequity of basic distribution of wealth in this country is a bigger problem than the lack of equality in that distribution. If you go to the doctor, I don't know if they do these things anymore, where they get you in and they sit cross-legged and they dunk your knee with a wee hammer, it's supposed to respond. Healthy response. That's what we're looking for here. No response to knowing quite how unequal Scotland is a sign of difficulty. So there's one or two of our weirds, but I just want to take you through another couple, because the point I'm trying to make here is what we have settled for accepting is weird. It's not normal. It's not really normal on average across Europe, and it certainly isn't normal for a social democracy. And if that's the direction that we think we're heading in, that's what we've been voting for all these years, then we should get an idea of what kind of is average or normal in social democracies, because bluntly, we ain't got a Scooby, because we ain't been living in one. So I like this to start off with, because it puts Scotland in a totally different context. I mean, we're used to understanding ourselves. Sorry, I'm on the way. We're used to understanding ourselves as the kind of frozen north of Britain. But as you'll see here as well, we're also the fertile south of Scandinavia. And when you stand in your own place, you are north, south, east and west to everything, as the dear old pharaohs have demonstrated by slapping themselves straight in the middle of that map, which is a great indication of what happens in life when you make your own maps as well. So, if we could move on. Now, I wanted to just give a practical example, because a lot of this is quite abstract, but I'm quite fond of actually getting down to some brass tacks. Anybody here been to Wick? Gosh, this always amazes me. Why? I mean, we were on a forced labour march for 16 years, but no, it was a great place. And anybody been to Hammerfest? Well, Hammerfest is the world's northernmost town. It's right at the top of Norway in Finnmark, and it's so cold there on a very cold winter of minus 50 degrees, let's say, that the kids can throw boiling water in the air and watch it turn to ice for the crack. And no matter what anyone tells you, Wick is not that cold. So you'll see, however, in the 1900s, these two places were very, very similar. I'm sorry, you folk that are there, because I can't do anything to move this speaker. But anyway, you could interchange them practically. And after that, their fortunes changed quite a bit. Now, in Hammerfest, in 1897, they became one of the first towns to introduce street lighting in Northern Europe. And you might think, well, so what? But if you'd lived through an Arctic winter, you'd understand. They put a little hydro on the back of a river at the back of Hammerfest, where the energy who's it sits now, and they ran five street lights off it. Whoa! And they funded it by a tax on beer, which the fishermen were a bit not very keen on. A year later, it actually broke down, but it just turned out no one had ever put this in so far north, so it wasn't insulated properly. They put it back in, found a better drop, got more energy. Every house in Hammerfest got light. And so there's little Hammerfest by 1900, sparkling away in the Arctic darkness, while more civilised towns like Thurso, further south, were dark. Now, at the same time, they began to think, well, hang on a minute, supposing we took that turbine out of the river and put it into the Kvalsund Strait. Now, this is a frisky little strait. It's more like the straits between our west coast islands. It's not a mother of a strait like the Pentland Firth. But nonetheless, it's pretty good. This is my pal Inger-Lisa Matheson. We went there to photograph the turbines, forgot that they're underwater. So she's basically being a turbine for me, but behind there is where they sit. So they put them in here and started working with them from the 1920s, modifying the design, changing the location, taking measurements, blah-de-blah-de-blah. And the net of it is that in 2015, the company, Hammerfest Strøm, that was set up to do this street lighting in 1897, their turbines will go into the water off our island of Isla to create the world's first tidally powered island. And it should have been us. There is no reason why that technology should not have belonged to us, that we should have developed it. I mean, do we not have engineers? Do we not have straits? Of course we do. Do we not have water? Our coastline is so long that if it was straightened out, it would cover a third of the globe. But it's a set of people in a place that should be killing them that came up with the intellectual capacity to use the water. And why is that? Well, I'd humbly suggest that in 1897, a Scot living near where my mother comes from would not have been able to touch a river for any purpose whatsoever, let alone go and start sticking hydroelectricity in it. You'll remember, for those of you who've read Neil Gunn's Highland River, a tremendous account of how the young hero of the book is almost taken out of the country for daring to poach a salmon while his family were starving. That has been the degree to which we have not had any purchase with rivers of our own. We don't get to touch them. They're beyond use. And let's not even use the past tense. That's still the case. The fabulous rivers in the north of Scotland are generally time-shared into the next century. What you'll get if you stand beside any of those rivers, you won't get a chance to create energy, and you probably won't get a fish. You'll get a water bailiff on your shoulder the second you've been there for more than a minute. Now that, again, we just accept as normal. But these guys never experienced that. Nor did they experience having to come cap in hand to the Crown Estates Commission to ask for permission to put something into the water here. And then to have to ask permission again to move it a foot this way, move it a foot that way. You cannot actually develop, progress, or experiment with energy unless you can touch the resource. And we have no more been able to touch our own rivers and lochs than we have been able to build on our land. That, I'm afraid, is our history, and it's weird. If we could go on. Here's another thing, housing. Now, you'll maybe know that Norway was occupied by the Germans during the war, and nowhere more so than the very far north, because it was strategically important. The Germans withdrew in October 1944 and burnt to the ground every house, every kennel, every hut, every last damn thing, apart from 3 churches, in an area half the size of Denmark. So the King of Norway was living in London at the time and put a broadcast out saying to Norwegians and Finnmark people, don't come back in a hurry, because there's nothing there. It was already very cold, and there's nothing, it's just a blasted terrain. And nobody paid the blindest bit of attention. They all horsed straight back the next week, and this is these ladies standing in their fur coats, when there's nothing around them at all except this wooden hut, Husbanken, which means the housing bank. And there's, you see, a lot about our history as well. House is hus, mouse is moose, dirty is mocket, and lass is quina, quine. So there's so much that we have in common. But anyway, here they are, and they're there at the beginning, ready to build their own world. And here's an interesting thing that I think tells you a lot of difference about the way that different countries' outlooks work. What the Husbanken did was give money and resources to people to go away and build their own house. 60% of the housing in Hammerfest today was built by its inhabitants, by their own hands in 1944. And that's, you might think, by gum, a family, a town of builders. No. A town of people who retained enough skill and belief in one another to work together to build things themselves that suited themselves because they expected to do that. They expected to have skin in the game of that important thing, their own house. They didn't expect somebody else to build it and then tell them, live in it, don't change the door knocker, don't do any repairs because we do them, don't move because you can't move until we tell you where to go. The council housing ethos that we've known in Scotland. And let me just say, I'm not knocking council housing for its role in Scotland's history, because the conditions of private housing in Scotland were absolutely appalling. I mean, overcrowding in the 1900s was 5 times the rate of London, Glasgow and London. And if anyone's read Angela's Ashes, that terrible book, if you remember, conditions in the cities of Scotland were worse. I mean, in Dundee, famously, around the same time, 1897, there were 5 toilets in Dundee, and 3 of them were in hotels. So, you know, there is terrible squalor in the cities of Scotland, and if council housing had not come to the rescue, quite honestly, a quarter of us would not be sitting here today. So, unless somebody intervened, and the state did, but we paid a price for it because it intervened in a different way than it did in all the Nordics, where the presumption was you would want to be in control, and the resources and power were shifted right down to the local level so you could do what you wanted. So that's one important difference. And as a result of that, you know, Hammerfest is quite a frisky little place today, with frisky people. Now, I love this here because this lady here, particularly, I was just walking past these women. They came down a 1-in-1 hill slope on these wooden sleighs, nearly to knock the legs off of me, and then kind of came to a neat little, I'm showing my age here, Olga Corbett sort of halt. And I took a picture of them, and this is typical. In the far north, lots of the older women travel around on these sleighs, and look how happy they are. You know, they've got their shopping in the front, their handbags, their wee pal by their side, you know. Look at her wee cheeks there, wee red cheeks. She's been out all day like that, you know. And it's fabulous, because you know what happens here. If there's a skift or a snow, everybody's basically confined to barracks. And this again, I think when you look at into the face of that woman, you're looking into the face of capacity. That's actually what resilience looks like. And people say you can tell a lot about a society by the way it treats its women. I think you can tell more about a society by the way old women treat themselves. And to that end, I came across these fabulous postcards which actually, you know, mimic the reality extraordinarily. There are a series that's quite sort of famous within the Nordic countries of these two very, very mischievous old women. If you could just, yep, you see it here. I love this one, because, you know, how would we put this politely, they seem to have dispensed with some undergarments. One of those lollopy nights, ladies. So, you know, that is fantastic. And then there's another one. Isn't that lovely? And that's the spring beginning to come into the harbour, I think in Helsinki actually, with the swan here, you know, as the harbinger of spring. And I mean, that is marvellous to me, but you don't get, could you imagine postcards like that in Scotland? Sadly, no, because you get that, And so, you know, what you produce in a sense about yourselves is a function of the reality. And the reality there is that people are tremendously self-reliant, but not self-reliant in this kind of pioneer, you go out and do it all on your own with no resources. All the resources of Nordic societies generally are kept at a very local level. That is one of the biggest differences with us, and it's our third or fourth, I'm not counting, weird. Here we are again. This is Inger Lisa with myself at a place called Skadi. Everyone takes their relaxation very, very seriously in Norway. You'll know they have huts. They all go to little modest weekend wooden huts. There's 368,000 of them in Norway, and there are 600 in Scotland. Here's our fifth weird. At our latitude, we're the only country that has no tradition of wooden huts that you go to at the weekend. There are a few left, like Carbeth and various places. Every year, people get evicted. Every year, people whose grandparents struggled to get a tiny little purchase, only renting, on a piece of land for a very modest hut. Every year, people are getting chucked off, as if it's not an important part of our heritage. And it's a very different thing, because these guys, their idea of a holiday is 2 months in their huts. You know, going back to work only when they absolutely have to. They spend every Easter there, the whole family gathers. And when I said to them, gosh, that's bizarre, because this family, 35 of them, pile into this cabin. And I said, is that not a bit, you know, kind of claustrophobic? And they said, well, how does your whole family get together? Well, how does it? And the main reason that people give in every survey for having these huts, the main thing they get out of it, is not reconnecting with nature, not relaxing, not any of those things, although they're all true. It's reconnecting with their family. And if you think about that then, that opportunity to have just guddling about, silly time, doing something that's not too important, away from all the work pressures, how on earth are we coping with not having that release of pressure? Well, here's the thing, we probably aren't. So there's a lot we could be learning from some of this, but of course it's terribly hard to have this sort of culture when you can't get hold of land. In Norway, land is nae a biggie. In fact, it's so nae a biggie, these folk don't even own the land that their hut stands on, despite the fact they have 3 generations of dogs buried there. So dog lovers, you know what that means. That's the real home. That's the one you'll never change. But these guys rent their land, and here's the thing. You know, what is affordable and accessible in a society is consumed a lot. So the Norwegians consume land a lot. The family that Inger-Lisa lives in have got 6 houses. And she is a teacher, he is a fisherman. But they have huts everywhere, they've got a general sense of purpose. Because why wouldn't you? It's cheap. What is cheap and accessible and consumed a lot in Scotland? Food, beer. You know, basically, we all got prosperous at the same time, the Scots and the Norwegians. We both discovered oil in the 1970s. They invested their wealth, both as a society and personally in families, in things they could do that were generally quite uplifting and improving their lives. We ate our wealth. And it's a shocking truth. But we're still trying to deal with that because we couldn't invest it in things that brought us outside of ourselves, because we can't get hold of land, we haven't even thought about it. So all of this seems to me quite important. Final thing to say here is that the reason these huts are located where they are is that they're on the edge of a great salmon fishing river called the Repperfjord. And the licence for a local person to fish the Repperfjord for a year costs £50. The licence for an incomer to fish the Repperfjord for a weekend costs £500. Now that's the right way round. And this is the other weird. Most countries put their own people's interests first. They don't come second and sort of, shoved around the corner after all the high flyers and the big money guys have been in and had the best. They put themselves first because it's their country. Whereas we have exactly the opposite experience. I mean, I'll bet the majority of people here, I know I'm going on about fishing a lot, but you kind of expect you would. We're living in a country with fantastic fishing resource. But I don't know how many people have been seriously fishing in the room. Anybody? Who has? Come on, there must be somebody. I mean, you've got 2 skiers. Right, that, I can suggest to you, is the most incredible indictment of our society. There's not a single person in the room that's been fishing in a country like Scotland. So, yeah, and just a few final points really. I mean, children matter enormously, and here you'll know that the Nordics have got affordable kindergarten. Here you'll see 3 lassies taking their lives in their hands by patting a coo. And as we all know, coos are actually children eating monsters. And if they don't eat them, they at the very least infect them with disgusting diseases that they carry for their entire lives. Not. Quite a lot of the kindergarten are outdoors, like this one here, and the kids are all outdoors all day. Now the purpose of that is to develop motor skills and sharing. And the point is, if you can actually manage to physically do things when you're young, when you talk, to be able to communicate, to share tasks, these are all the things that create the kind of soft skills that you need to be a citizen today. And this is terribly tragic for Scotland, because since we don't do that, we not only have parents, particularly mums, who are stressed out of their boxes, but we also have grunting boys. Now that phenomenon is very linked to a lack of engagement between 0 and 3, because 60% of vocabulary apparently is in place by the age of 3. James Heckman won his Nobel Prize for Economics, an American, in the year 2000 for proving that the biggest return that society gets from investment is at the age of 3. If he tested 2 and 1, I suspect he would probably have found a greater return, but he didn't. So we know what works, and yet we keep not doing it. But the smart modern democracies have understood something. They've understood that, it's fine to think you can have a set of children who largely are brought up at home if they're definitely going to get a lot of engagement in those early years. Actually, in the UNICEF Child Wellbeing Index, Cyprus is often as high as Denmark. And the reason is because they still have families with 6 wains, 2 grannies, 4 goats, 2 stay-at-home parents, and a lot of busyness happening around the home. So there's a lot of engagement. But, here's the news, folks. We ain't having 6 kids. We're having 1.4. And that 1.4 kid will be struggling, actually, to get a lot of engagement when 60 to 70% of their mums are working. So the smart countries have begun to think about that and have moved to put massive investment in excellent childcare. Not so-so, because they understand that so-so continues to make anxiety amongst parents, so it has to be absolutely excellent. And it lasts until the kids are 6 or 7. They don't go to school till 6 or 7. And despite that later start, the kids in Finland in particular are scoring the highest educational attainment in the world. That's more than the Japanese, the South Koreans, all the other economies that are actually producing very well-educated kids. The Finns are at the top, with their kids doing nothing but playing until they're 7, together, learning to share, and then starting school. So, you know, these guys are doing something right, and we're doing something wrong. This is a woman who tried to start a Norwegian-style kindergarten in Coatbridge. You'll see it's called the Barnehage, which tells you something else. Our bairns comes from that Norwegian word barn. So she set this up to be like a Norwegian-style kindergarten. The first thing the council did was tell her she had to put this wooden thing round it in case paedophiles came to look at the children, which stopped the whole thing stone dead. And here, there's a higher than average table, which is used deliberately because it means that the kids have to help one another onto that bench to sit there and have their lunch. Now, everything is chosen quite deliberately to encourage sharing. And if you watch this, it's the sweetest thing to watch big bairns helping the littler ones on, because none of them get fed till they're all up. And that's not allowed in Coatbridge because it's 6 inches higher than the average table here. Now, this kind of infantilizing, you know, we could sit and swap stories a lot. This is another weird for Scotland, and the whole of Britain actually, but it's being trapped by ludicrous laws or rules that we know are rubbish. And when I was in Linlithgow, I was speaking about this, and a chap immediately sort of cottoned on, and he said, I know what you mean. He said, there's an underpass in Linlithgow, and the light bulb in it is always broken. And I keep complaining to the council, nothing gets done. And I said, why don't you fix it yourself? What? Why should I have to fix it? That's, you know, the council should do that. And I was watching him and noticing that half the audience had begun to fall asleep. And I thought, this isn't the first time he's complained about this. So I said to him, pal, you know, people in the room have lost the will to live. Your knuckles are white, your face is purple, your blood pressure is through the roof. Give yourself a break and get a light bulb. And just for a second he thought, do you know, I could actually. I could put them in my bag. And then something kicked in and he said, I couldn't. Do you know what would happen? I'd get done for defacing council property. And you know, he might. But there's a great saying that the Norwegians have, which is, ask for forgiveness, not permission. And we might need to have that tattooed across our foreheads here. Because we are, every time that you submit to a set of laws that make no sense whatsoever, and in fact, you know, produce absolutely contrary outcomes, a little bit of you dies. It does. And a little bit of belief that society can ever work dies. And you can't have that, because that erodes all trust, and trust is the only thing that keeps a society working. So we've got a lot to think about on that front as well. The light bulb. And there's Wick. Now I remember at the beginning we had that comparison between Hammerfest and Wick. And Hammerfest has been thriving, Wick has not. Wick has lost its port status, it lost it about 10 years ago. That was a pretty bad day, I'll grant you that. It's got a drugs problem, lots of little towns have, and it has no control whatsoever over itself. And this is pretty well why. Our, I don't know, I've lost count now, 6th weird is that we have the largest so-called local authorities in Europe. Now, again, I can tell you, and I'm beginning to get the measure of this audience, so I'm not expecting any reaction, folks, that the average council in Scotland has 165,000 people. Good. Now that is beyond weird. If I could go forward for a minute, let me show you something. Here are the kind of medians. Medians take, if there's outliers that make the average look unusual, median is a bit more of a representative thing. So here we are again. And if you like, the average population of a council area in Germany is about 7,000 people. Now you'll accept that the Germans are not doing bad economically, eh? And they can play football. So, you know, they're actually doing quite well. And here they are. The way they're doing well is based on being extraordinarily local, powerfully local. 7,000 people on average, Scotland, 115,000. I mean, that's unbelievably different. And, you know, cast your eyes along, nobody's anywhere near us. If you look at the physical size of a council, it's 15 square kilometres in Germany, which might be the size, well, I'm not good at maths, but you know, a wee place is Neilston, 15 square kilometre, I don't know. And here, 990 square kilometres. And you might say, well, we've got more sort of empty, remote bits than Germany. Not more than Norway and Sweden, though, huh? So, you know, we're doing something extraordinarily strange here, which is just, we've lost all local contact. If you could go back to that map slide a minute. here's how we are at the minute with our 32 so-called local councils, and here's what Scotland would look like if it had the European average size of council. Now, I get that you're not an emotional bunch of people, but I find that quite extraordinary. There are 517 councils there. And what that means really is that if we were on a par with the way Europe operates, all the wee places would have a council. In fact, we would be quite close to the 1931 parish council map in Scotland. Now the thing is, not many people have big warm and fuzzies about 1931, not just because we weren't there, but because they were very often fiefdoms for the great and the good. I looked at Roxburgh Council, and in the last century, for 20 years, Roxburgh Council was run by the Duke of Roxburgh. For another 20 years, it was run by the Duke of Buccleuch. Now, I think that's what you call being kippered. You know, very likely, if you lived there, that the Duke of Roxburgh was your landlord, your landowner, your employer, your feudal superior, and he ran the council. And we call that local democracy. You're having a laugh. So, you know, there's nothing in the repository of the Scottish brain, not too much. There are some good examples. Tom Johnson was a fabulous, who was the great Scottish secretary who bought power to the Glens, was a Kirkintilloch councillor, set up a fabulous municipal bank there, as well as a great City of Glasgow friendly society. So some local councils were incredibly progressive, but some were both. So we don't have a kind of, we can just go back to that, it was all good then. We have to create something new out of local. And we have to start remembering the only thing that matters in life, really, is our own engagement. It's harnessing us that is the task. And at the moment, we're being flared off our own democratic structures the same way that we used to flare gas off an oil rig, because we couldn't figure it had any value. Now it turns out to be the only thing that probably had value. So we've got to fix that. And this is just the final point. If you could just flick through these, I'm sorry because I haven't got my finger on the pulse here. Keep going, there's a couple of points to be made, one after the other, which gives me a chance to sort of often have a glass of... Well, this is the other point, because I mean, what I've illustrated there would be enough to make you slit your wrists or leave pretty pronto. But the reason that, you know, that there is, to me, tremendous cause for optimism is actually the people of Scotland. If you lived in a right-sized democracy, all you have to do is turn out and vote to make things change in your local area. You know, if you live in Norway, for example, 1 in 80 people stands for election. In Scotland, it's 1 in 2,000. There's a much more vigorous thing going on there, so people have an easier route to making things work if they're not. In Scotland, you have to be a hero. To change things, you have to be a hero. Especially in your community, you have to face putting decades of effort into getting a small thing changed. And you have to run the risk that you might lose, that you might actually you might become an obsessive, that you might become so bitter because you don't succeed that it affects your health, even your relationships. That's what you have to run the gauntlet of to get things changed at the community level, because there are people in every community doing their dinger to make things work, and they risk a lot by doing it. And I just want to show you a couple of examples, because that's the flip side of this. The Scots are remarkable. No, I mean, the things I've seen in my life in terms of community effort, no one in the Nordics would have dreamt of doing, because they have never had to. They've had decent government for more than a century. But the loads that we voluntarily put on our own backs until we literally can hardly move, that demonstrates an incredible capacity, which if you could just imagine that the authorities getting behind for once, instead of trying to trip up, as they seem to, what an amazing prospect there would be because of the capacity of Scots. Anyway, here is a chap, Ron Greer and Derek Pretzwell. These are two ecologists in Perthshire. I think Derek would be quite proud if I told you he is an obsessive and he can bore for the universe about the Arctic char. Now, to me, that is merely a fish, but it is a sacred species for Ron, and it has been fading out of lochs all over Scotland because you need leaf litter falling into lochs to let the wee bugs eat the leaf litter, the big bugs eat the wee bugs, the fish eat the big bugs. That's a wee biology lesson, by the way. And you can see here how it's not happening, because overgrazing has meant there's no trees growing beside lochs anymore. So what Ron wanted to do to get his fish back was to show that some of these areas that look completely impossible could actually grow trees. And this is what he started with. Now, would you have given him tuppence for his chances of growing trees on that? And yet that's classic overgrazing as a result of the way that landowners have run the land. So his idea was he would plant the trees through lupins and Scotch broom, because both of these return nitrogen to the soil, they raise the temperature at the roots, and they give a bit of shelter to the saplings. And that's enough to let them grow. So here's what happened. There's year one, you can see the lupins are all happening there. No trees yet, so everyone told them they were mad, they'd killed the trees. Yeah, year two, the Scotch broom is fairly taken on, but once again, everyone said, you're mad, you've killed the trees. But year five, just what they predicted happened. And then by about year 10, they'd got a pretty reasonable forest. And what they then thought they would do was they made an application to buy 100,000 acres of land in Perthshire to do this thing to en masse. Now, can you imagine what that would have been like? Quite apart from the autumn colours would have knocked anything in New England into a cocked hat. What would have been possible for the people of Pitlochry, Burnham and Dunkeld was they estimated that they would become energy self-sufficient within 20 years by coppicing the trees. That's not knocking them down, but just taking, lopping off the branches. And as you know, with fuel prices the way they are, that's not nothing. So it was all looking quite encouraging. The Scottish Enterprise even backed it. So you might see where this is headed. And somebody asked, do either of these guys have academic qualifications? Oh. And they didn't. Now, who knows if that's the reason the whole thing went pear-shaped? They were never told. But it did go pear-shaped. The estate was just sold, as usual, to one private guy. And this today is all that Ron gets to stand beside, is, you know, a small glimpse of what might have been sitting behind a bit of barbed wire. Is he angry? Oh, yes. Is he bitter? Yes. Is he hard to know? Yes. And is this what happens to people when they get thwarted after pouring decades of their life into something, proving the capacity of something, and then being thwarted by a bureaucrat's tick of a box? Yes, this is very, very typical. And just by the by, the other place they had thought of doing this was the Rest and Be Thankful, which, as you'll know, is the road that's always shut because of landslips. Here's another one closer to home, Drumchapel. This is Tommy Riley, who set up the Drumchapel Men's Health Group in 1996. Very brave move. As you'll know, Drumchapel is a very tough place to live. Most of the guys here had problems with drink or drugs. Nearly all of them had industrial diseases from the age of their mid-20s. They were on the job scrap heap. They were angry. They were violent sometimes to their partners. They were passing the pain down the line to someone smaller than themselves. That is the Scottish way. At least it is in some estates where things are very hard. Nobody really batted an eyelid too much of that behaviour because it was the mark of a hard man. And eventually, Tommy decided it had to stop. So he applied for some cash. Miraculously, they got it, opened this men's health group. And in the first year, half the guys here managed to stop smoking through acupuncture. There was an 18-week waiting list for aromatherapy in Drumchapel. And the most popular course was cookery, because the guys realised they might not have a proper job, but they had a job, they were fathers, and they began to reconceptualise their entire idea of what their role in life was. And they had 40 trained volunteers by the end of that year. Not nothing, and something that could have moved that whole project out at a peer education level quite across Drumchapel. And again, you might sense what's about to come. The health board didn't renew the money. £84,000. Tommy was pretty devastated by it. They kept going for 7 months, but they couldn't get money from anywhere. You know, considering how much poverty and men's health is supposed to have mattered in this country for decades, not a penny. So I lost track of them, and in the course of writing this book, I got back in touch to see what happened with Tommy, and it wasn't good. Before this, Tommy was the only one of this group who didn't drink. He became an alcoholic shortly after he went down the tubes. His marriage split up. He developed COPD and he died last year at the age of 62. And that is a small tragedy, like it is for all the people who have poured their lives into trying to do something and have simply been rejected. And if you go on, I mean, I would suggest that Tommy is the Scottish effect, that premature death. Because here's where we are. These are all the different causes of mortality, early mortality, and the ones on the, and this blue line is an average for Liverpool and Manchester that gives you a sense of comparison. You'll see that the first three causes are pretty even, so they're maybe not of so much concern. But these ones here, where the Glasgow figures are soaring above the Liverpool-Manchester average, that should worry us. And what are they? You might think that they're heart disease, cancer. No, that's the first two. The last four here are suicide, violence, alcohol abuse and drug abuse. Now, what are they? You know, it strikes me that is a demonstrator of hopelessness. So we have to change this, because every community has someone like Tommy. Every community has someone like Ron. And I haven't time to go through the many women who have changed their communities too, very principally the Isle of Egg, which was a very, very female-dominated community buyout. So everywhere has got people who are ready to do this, but most of them are having to work against authority. And this to me is the absolute scandal, the thing we must change. Because just on the very last slide, honestly, now this looks complicated, but it gives you a sense of how societies are different. This chap, Geert Hofstede, was a sociologist, a Dutch sociologist, and he measured the responses in 72 countries of the world and kind of compared them. It's a long story, but here's the short of it. He had masculine and feminine countries. And by feminine countries, he didn't mean countries run by women, sadly. He was talking about baskets of characteristics. So masculine countries were top-down, elitist, devil take the hindmost, winner takes all, cutthroat, quite exciting and maybe quite innovative. Don't know if that's reminding you of anywhere. And feminine countries were more cooperative, consensual. They could tend to be a little bit less innovative, and they didn't hog the world headlines by any means. They just got on with it. If you were to take an example of something, well, let's say we, for example, are a sporting nation, aren't we, folks? Because we got a wheen of medals in the Commonwealth Games. Well, that's true. At the same time, half of us can't run for the bus. Now, those two things are true at the same time, but which matters more? A masculine society will always be more concerned about the elite. It'll be very chuffed that we won 40,000 medals. That will prove we're a sporting nation. It doesn't. It proves we have an elite capable of winning medals. That's great. But their belief is that if you pour more money, resources, profile, everything into that elite, somehow when Chris Hoy gets his next gold medal cycling, I'll puff up a hill a wee bit faster. And that doesn't work. That trickle-down idea doesn't work in sport any more than it does in economics or society. A feminine country will be far more worried about where the average is. Not the top, not where the elite is, but where the average is. They'll be far more worried about the fact half of us can't run for the bus. So their interest will be trying to pull the average up, because their belief will be the elite will rise anyway. And actually, as you'll see, you know, these feminine countries are no slouches at sporting performance in any case, but they'll always be more interested in the average. Now the question is, where on that line do you want to be? Because where we are at the moment, well, here we are. On this feminine rankings, Sweden is number 1. You see the Nordics are right up at the top for being the most feminine countries. And there's dear old the UK, number 62. Now, it's not quite the bottom, but it's pretty blooming masculine, for which read, pretty competitive, top-down elitist. Actually, if Scotland was an independent country today, it would be 63, because our teenage pregnancy rates are worse than England. So that's the shameful position that we're sitting in at the moment. And if we don't do anything, if we don't try to change our outlooks, if we do vote for independence or if we don't, and just keep having the same defaults, if we just want to be a wee bit better than England at things, we'll be 62 for the rest of time. And here's what 62 does for you, or rather, here's what being number 1 does on this table. If you correlate with it the child well-being rankings, you notice that the feminine countries are right at the top. This is the figures for 2003 and 2013, in case you thought it was a flash in the pan. Actually, the statistics have been relatively unchanged for 30 years. We have been generally at the position we're in, which is 20, 16th, whatever. Then you might think, well, that's fine, but probably these people don't make much money. Wrong. This is the GDP results here from the OECD for the year 2000, and you'll see there's no particular pattern actually to who's doing better or worse. So it doesn't make any difference. Actually, you could argue that there is another pattern. The AAA credit ratings, we lost ours last year. That's the measure of whether the big money guys think your country is good for repaying debt. The people who are now the triple credit A rated nations, all the Nordics, except Iceland, but give them a couple of years, Switzerland, Singapore, Luxembourg, somewhere I always forget, Canada, Germany, and Australia. And you'll notice something about those countries. The countries are wee countries. There are roughly a population of 8 million. The federal countries have a properly democratic structure. Not for them the sort of asymmetric devolution that we would be promised. They started off sharing power properly. And I'm so impressed with the Australians and Canadians with the track record of the mother of parliaments that they set up new countries differently. In fact, the final straw perhaps is the Germans, because the success of Germany that I was talking about being so local, that is very much based on the work that British civil servants did after the Second World War. When everyone had spotted that the very concentrated nature of power in Germany had been part of the reason that one evil man was able to control the whole country. And they thought, we're not having that again. So they went in and made sure that all the levels of government were absolutely separated. That's the reason that today, the world's most powerful woman, Angela Merkel, cannot impose a council tax freeze in Germany, like Alex Salmond can do here, because those layers are completely separate. So our civil servants went over, did that, created the good society that Germany became, came back home to the most centralised, top-down, elitist country in Europe, and pulled up the drawbridge. Now we can change all this, but you know what I think we have to get at the end of it all is that the greatest resource of any country is its people. And this is the one, you'll accept that in principle, but I think many Scots still fear that actually somehow the capacity of Scots is not high. And to me that is the ultimate tragedy, because the only thing that has been an anchor around our ankles has been the top-down governance that we've endured for 200 years that has largely left the initiative of community-based Scots untapped. And that's the thing that we absolutely need to change. The only difference really between the Scots and the Nordics is that we have never known what they have known for 200 years, which is a government that has trusted and empowered them. Thank you very much.
We are over our time, but would you be willing to answer 2 or 3 questions?
Yes, of course. I mean, if anyone needs to go, do you feel that you can go?
Yeah, you're dying of heat. I realise that some folk may well be wanting to ask questions. Time for 2 or 3 questions. Don't force yourself. And yeah. First one here, and then 1, 2, 3. Yep.
Andy Whiteman was here
Last month,
last month, and yourself spoke about land reform effectively. You know, what do you have any hope that this would happen after independence, or the pressure increase for that, or very more powerful?
I'll tell you what, let's take the 3 questions in case they echo one another, but I get that one.
And the second one was Irish. Yep.
Yeah.
If the in novo, what's the difference in the chances of being able to achieve this kind of model between yes vote and a no vote?
Yeah.
My question's kind of similar, but it's about if we have a yes vote and we are kind of, as Alexander thinks he has a mandate according to the white paper, which doesn't seem to sit alongside this Nordic model. What are your opinions on how we as the people can move towards that?
Well, just to run through them for a minute, there's huge possibilities. I mean, Sandy sitting next to you could speak volumes on this as well from Mull, but there's been a land reform review group some of you may be aware of. Actually, it's interesting, how many people are aware of that? Which sat for 18 months to look at the whole problems of land reform. It was pretty lacklustre actually. It produced an interim report that was so basically mealy-mouthed that Professor Jim Hunter, who was a very prominent land reformer from Inverness, resigned to draw attention actually to how weak it was, and it was then restocked, as it were, with some slightly new ambitions and new people, and it came out with a zinger actually in its report about 2 months ago. Just to run through a couple of things it's proposing. First of all, it's suggesting there should be a maximum acreage per person or interest in Scotland. Now that's total newie, and that's actually not British. You know, Britishness doesn't know maximum anything. There's no concept of more of enough in British thinking. You know, you can have as much to eat as you like, you can have as much to drink as you like, you can buy as much land as you like. Money talks. There's no intervention or regulation in the amount of anything. So that idea of a maximum acreage is totally foreign actually to British policy making. That's actually Nordic. All the Nordic countries have got very strict rules on how much land you can own. Denmark, for example, you need to have done 5 years at agricultural college before you can buy farming land. And that fairly sorts the toffs from the farmers. So that at a stroke changes an awful lot of the dynamics here remarkably. There's also a proposal that tenants who are on the land and have been in a terrible position for decades and centuries should have a right to buy. There's another proposal which might seem surprising to you, which is that the sporting estates should finally pay some sort of rates. Now you might be shocked to know they don't. They're exempt from rates, so they don't pay anything at all. These powers should, and primogeniture would be done away with. This is a situation where the eldest son can inherit legally all the land and his siblings can't contest it. And if that, for example, was done away with on mainland Europe in 1801, when the Napoleonic Code was adopted in lots of countries of Europe, since then they've had equality in inheritance. So in 1926, the English abolished primogeniture, and the reason that it wasn't extended to Scotland then was because Scottish landowners in the House of Lords blocked it. So we have simply, you don't need to be a tricoteuse sitting at the foot of the guillotine with all sorts of radical thoughts to put forward 4 proposals which in the rest of Northern Europe are normal and have been normal for up to 200 years. So all we'd be doing by putting these measures through is a big catch-up operation, at the end of which you could then consider, if you wanted, a change to a land tax. My feeling about this is it's good for the meantime to do the things around which there is the most consensus. And the 4 things I've mentioned there, I have not come across a single meeting yet in 130 since September the 9th where anybody has a real problem with those 4 things. They seem intuitively fair enough. So I think what we should do is try and move on what everyone's got consensus with, and when trust is built by beginning to see that our system can change to something fairer without the world falling around our necks, we could then begin to build more of a debate about changing the way our whole taxation works. And maybe some of that is the question there about would a no vote allow us to move in any of these directions? It would be difficult because, and in fact this is very related to your question too, because clearly if you want to shift if you want to shift around what you do in a society, you must be able to shunt the money about. You don't need me to tell you this, but it's like you trying to make some massive change in your life out of your pocket money. You know, you can't manage to shift the gears well enough, I think, unless you have control of the whole shebang. Now, you could have control of the whole shebang and not the will to use the powers you have. And that's perhaps the direction that there's a bit of worry about. And that too seems to me to be a product of the kind of environment our politicians have grown up in. And this is not slagging any of them off, because you can only know the situation that you've lived in for your entire lives. So everybody, including Alex Salmond, who spent 21 years at Westminster, is steeped in Westminster outlooks. I mean, it's like what I was saying earlier about trying to, you know, so fascinated about what you're trying to avoid, you head straight for it. The only template there is in British society at the moment is Britain. Slap my thigh. I mean, it's not much of a surprise. So what we do here is just a little bit less of Britain. You know, we have a round kind of chamber instead of an aggressive one, and we have a daytime sittings instead of evening ones. That's not really all that much of a difference. So I think it'll take a bit of time and basically learning a lot more about what our kindred countries have been doing for the last 200 years before people begin to see that there might be different ways to do this. And a really important point to make is back to this one about trust. If I was asked to pay more tax now as part of the UK, or even actually as part of an independent Scotland immediately, I might hesitate. And the reason for that is, particularly as part of the UK, if I pay more tax, it goes on Trident, it goes on bankers' bonuses, it goes on financing the administration of the bedroom tax, it goes on managing to spend more on privatising aspects of healthcare in England than it's spent on the public health service. I don't want my tax spent on that. And that's the breach of trust that stops people wanting to pay tax. Because most people are fair enough. If they saw social goods that actually they were likely to use as well in life, they'd be likely to cough up. But as you know, what happens in Britain, Scotland is no different, is that people are so worried about the standards of public services that they make provisions privately for their parents, you know, for old folks' homes, let's say. They end up spending in Edinburgh up to £1,300 for a kindergarten place, a full-time place. The equivalent in Norway is a maximum of £200. You know, when you look through the rubbish services that we get, and this is not being nasty to any of the individuals concerned, but it's the overarching template of the way Britain has become from the deal that was done after the Second World War.